Another Growing Down live stream / mutations. This is a bit of a hybrid episode, as you may have noticed. And we are joined today by the great Ben Burgis, who is the host of Give Them an Argument show, which is a new show, relatively new.
Yeah, it's
And
9 episodes in, so yeah.
yeah, so yeah, Ben is the author of the self-titled Give Them an Argument, Logic for the Left, and the forthcoming book Canceling Comedians While the World Burns, which I just love the title of that, and hopefully we'll get into that a little bit today. What we wanted to do is to really just kind of open up and with talking with you about your recent debates with folks like Ayn Randians and libertarians, and how's that been going in terms of, I've just been noticing you've been jumping on these debates more frequently, and I'm wondering if that's sort of part of your praxis, philosophically speaking, in terms of speaking across the aisle.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, I think that one thing that, I've been pushing since writing Gave Them an Argument, the book, is that the left, shouldn't be afraid that we're maybe giving people legitimacy by arguing with them, or, thinking that it's just pointless to do that, because no one can be convinced that it's actually that it's a worthwhile thing to do. It helps us clarify, our own ideas to sort of be forced to make those arguments. It helps us not lose, persuadable people, who might, if we never get around to really explaining exactly what's wrong with what, the case that people on the other side are making, then they might kind of drift away from us. And yeah, I mean, it's fun, or maybe at least it's fun if you're a certain kind of strange nerd.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Ryan over here is also very interested in the art of debating online, and I think it's a very interesting approach to not silo ourselves and not just remain on the left, but actually reach across the aisle, learn something from that kind of engagement. And do you find that there is a genuine, I know you've mentioned this before, but you reach somebody, one or two people at least, during an argument. Do you find converts or folks who kind of change?
Oh yeah, no, for sure. And I think that sometimes people make the mistake of thinking it's pointless because nobody ever changes their mind, and there's a germ of truth to that. Like when they say that, I think what they're really primarily thinking of is that it's very rare that anybody changes their mind immediately in the room, right? And I think realistically, that's just not how persuasion really works. Certainly, when I can think back to all the times that I've changed my mind about things, usually when I first hear a good argument for a position I don't like, my initial reaction is probably going to be irritation, but then it sort of starts burrowing in your head, and it starts to bother you, and you might realize weeks later, you think back to it, you're like, oh, that actually was a really good point, wasn't it? And so I again, I know probably people have heard me make this joke before, but whenever I hear, whenever I see people say, oh, nobody ever changes their mind, it always amazes me, because invariably when you actually dig into the bio of the person saying this, it's always some story oh, you grew up in a conservative evangelical household, and then you became an atheist when you were 17 because you were watching Richard Dawkins videos, and you were just a regular MSNBC liberal until 2016, and then you voted for Bernie, and then you joined the DSA, and now you're halfway to Maoism, and you're going to tell me that nobody ever changes their mind. But I think that, I certainly do have people, tell me that they change their mind about things, because of these things. But also, I think that a lot of times, when people do, it's not because of any one thing; it's because of a lot of things, that are happening at the same time, and they have to be in the right place at that moment to kind of be receptive to being convinced, and they might encounter a few different things along the way that that help kind of nudge them. But I think that since it is one of the things that we can do, right? At least as long as we're not going to save the world by arguing with people on the internet, but because as long as we are doing things like having left magazines and left podcasts and, and all those things. I think it's one of the most useful things that we can do with those platforms to kind of plant some of those seeds of doubt in people who might otherwise gravitate to the other side.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, Ben, this is Matt. Oh, yeah. I had a question for you. So what do you think the argument kind of going sort of and I did read your logic book, and I think I noted to you on Twitter, it's going to take me my whole life to actually incorporate all of the different sort of arguments you make in there for logic, et cetera, to know them and name them. But one of my questions is, if you were on the opposite side arguing about the left, what are some arguments you would make that could better our position? I know one of the reasons why we started this podcast was sort of when Bernie was in it. He eventually lost, and we had some guests on, and some of the consensus on why did Bernie lose, I think the consensus was it kind of lacked a coherent narrative. So I was wondering, what are some things that you think could prop up the left better?
Yeah, I mean, I think that something that, like, I've seen Corey Robin talk about a good bit is that oftentimes we don't do a good enough job of grounding, like like we sort of talk as if there are a bunch of different values that, like, maybe are all important and they're all going to sort of lead to what we want. And I think that's fine to a point. I think there might even be sort of an abstract sense in which that's true. But I think that it's maybe not super useful politically, rhetorically. I think that it's better to be more focused. And I think that the Bernie campaign was at its best. It didn't do that much of it, but it did a little bit. And I was excited when it did it, when it really started talking a lot more about freedom. Since I think Americans in particular are likely to really put a lot of emphasis on that. And I think that if our case is, okay, sure, freedom's nice, but, like, have you heard about compassion and equality? I think that's going to be less effective than if we make the case, which actually I think also has the merit of being right, that the most important kinds of freedom are actually really enhanced by a left project. That the kind of freedom that matters most. If you have, like, oftentimes people talk about freedom in terms of freedom from coercion, but I think that doesn't actually take us very far, for one thing, because coercion, like violating your rights, like taking away something you have a right to, like, talking that way just kind of pushes back the question, because, like, what people with different political views are really arguing about is who has a right to what. So, like, that doesn't really settle much. And also, there's an argument. I wrote an article about this with Matt McManus last year called "Why Everybody Values Freedom," and one of the things not original to us, right? But that we brought up is, if you primarily think of freedom in terms of freedom from coercion, then that's like saying, like, okay, if you have two slaves and one of them is owned by somebody who beats them all the time and one of them is owned by somebody who almost never beats them, is the one who's almost never beaten freer, right? I mean, they might be luckier, but they're not freer, right? Because the more fundamental problem isn't this particular violation of their rights that happens. It's that relationship of domination. And I think that certainly in terms of, like, the kind of long-term radical socialist goals that would matter to me about changing the structure of workplaces, I think there's a pretty obvious tie in there. But even in terms of the kind of short-term goals that the Bernie campaign was about, I think that you can make a really compelling case there. So for example, right, there's a book called The Nordic Way of Everything. I'm not going to try to pronounce the author's name because it's a Finnish name that I know I'm going to mess up, but it's by this Finnish journalist who got married to an American guy, and she moved to America. And a lot of what the book's about is her kind of being shocked by all of the effects of not having much of a welfare state on society, in terms of things like the relationships between parents and children, husbands and wives, bosses and workers, being, in her mind, almost these, like, quasi-feudal relationships of dependency that where like Finnish college kids might, turn 18 and they're really living their own lives to a much greater extent. A lot of American middle-class college kids have to have these like their parent, they're like middle-class parents will like make their kids call them every day, and they can kind of get away with that because this relationship of extreme dependency, because they rely on them to pay for their tuition bills, which in that case, might be a little overbearing, but not a big deal. I think it becomes a much bigger deal in cases like, imagine, for example, a gay college student who might feel hesitant about coming out to his evangelical family because he's worried that they'll stop writing the checks, or there are people who stay in bad marriages because they don't want to lose their spousal health insurance. Certainly, there are people who stay in jobs they hate because they don't want to lose their employer health insurance. So the effect of doing the kinds of things that Bernie was advocating, of having socialized health insurance at least, and free and tuition-free public higher education, is to cut some of the strings that are involved in these relationships of dependency, and make people more free to live their lives, however they want to live them. And again, there was a little bit of that in the Bernie campaign. I remember they did one ad in particular that kind of played up this point, but I think there definitely should have been a lot more of that. And then I guess just to connect it to connect it back to how you started your original question, I think that this is one of the places where engagement with the right can actually really help us, because they are going to constantly talk up the freedom stuff, and it's easy to sort of roll your eyes or do memes about it, more freedom, whatever. But I think that a vastly more politically useful response is to sort of try to engage with that and try to think about, okay, why is freedom something we care about in the first place? And then what should that tell us about what kind of freedom is most important? And then if we can actually then pitch our politics differently because we're thinking about that, then I think we're in a much better position.
I love that answer so much. So Ben, I wanted to ask you about cancel culture and this sensationalized conversation around the class reductionist allegation and the tensions between the identitarian left. I saw your debate with Vosh, and so I'm wondering, you and Michael Brooks, I was rereading the Cosmopolitan socialism article that you had written about the late and great Michael Brooks, and some of his criticisms of the extremes of the left, the woke left, the Robin DiAngelo left, and how that also gives the IDW and the right a lot of ammunition, right, to make these attacks. That was one of Michael's criticisms. And so I'm wondering, first, how big of a problem do you think the hyper woke identitarian left is, and what do you think a possible solution could be going forward to like integrate them or make them happy in a sense, so that the class reductionist argument doesn't become so much of a conflict and cause more factioning and divisiveness on the left?
Yeah, sure. So I think that since you mentioned class reductionism, I guess I'll just say like the boring but I think true thing about this is that these debates, like the thing you mentioned with Vosh, are often very frustrating because it's often a little unclear to me what's actually meant by class reductionism. I had an article about this for Ryan Smith, or I think he's embraced the unusual last name. So I think now it's Ryan Zickraff Smith's, which is his actual name. His Substack publication, The Third Rail, called it's like The Search for the Mythical Class Reductionist, where it's often really unclear what people mean, because I think there are some like really kind of esoteric theoretical disagreements that you might be pointing to when you use this label, and we could argue about those. But I think the sting of the accusation comes from the implication that people are class reductionists. That means they just don't care about, or are maybe even hostile to. Certainly, they're not like avid supporters of other important things that aren't directly economic. Like gay or trans rights, or concerns about racism or other things like that. And I think that's And then if that is what you mean, right, then I always really like want you like, I mean, I want you. I want to see some names, right? You know, it's like who specifically are we talking about, right? Who falls into this? And I think at least generally speaking, you know, in my experience, when people throw around that accusation, and they do actually start naming names, you know, I'm very unpersuaded. You know, it's like because they tend to come up with people who are like, wait a second, you're kidding, right? Like Adolf Fried doesn't care about racism. It seems like he's been writing about it for like 50 years. But then as far as cancel culture and certain kinds of excesses of left identitarianism, which I do think are slightly different issues, but I think they're related. The reason I think they're slightly different issues is that I think that cancel culture, which, you know, I realize is a very imprecise term, but I think that's kind of what we're stuck with at this point. Like that's what everybody uses. And I'd usually much rather argue about the things themselves than argue about which labels we apply to them. That it's, I think it's not unique to the left. I think it's a general disease of neoliberalism that impacts the entire political spectrum. What I mean by that is that we live in a society where people are incredibly atomized and isolated from each other, and oftentimes feel most connected to the people online, or at least a certain kind of person does. And then oftentimes something people will say when they're actually minimizing the problem, they say, oh, there's no such thing as cancel culture, whatever, is they'll say, oh, you're just talking about the internet. And there's some truth to that, because I think that a big part of the problem is the bad incentives built into the big tech platforms themselves, that they really reward our worst impulses, because you get this the way that they're set up to make them as addictive as at all possible, which, you know, I think at this point you can find plenty of testimonials from people who work for those companies that it is their goal. Really reward our worst impulses, because they really incentivize denouncing first and asking questions later, you know, so you can get that instant validation from thousands of strangers, you know, cheering you on. And then I think the third element in that kind of witch's brew is the fact that, at least in America, and, you know, this stuff is by no means limited to America, but America is kind of the epicenter of it. Most people work in non-unionized workplaces with at-will employment, meaning that they can be fired without any particular due process or appeal, which lends an extra kind of charge to the problem, that because that gives this about you know, people have to worry that they could get fired, right, over like somebody's interpretation of something they tweeted, and you can find. And I think you could find examples of people doing this sort of these very cancel-y kind of hair-triggered denunciations, calling for people to be fired, whatever. Certainly from the right, right? You know, people who are trying to like get somebody fired for, you know, like a Starbucks barista said "fuck Trump," and, you know, so they'll like post the video on Twitter and try to get her fired. That's a real case. Or like, you know, Elizabeth Warren supporters, you know, yelling at some graduate student and like trying to like tag his university to get him fired. Like, I think this stuff happens all across the spectrum. But I also think that, to tie into what you said about left identitarianism, that it is a particular problem, or at least a problem that I particularly care about when it happens on the left. One, because I think it kind of interacts with more specific pathologies of the left, like what you're kind of pointing to, Ryan, and also, and then because with the product of that interaction is this really toxic brew that's like very alienating to most of the people that we want to win over, right? I mean, I think that if you showed most people who start out somewhat sympathetic to the left on a policy level, right, I think if you just gave them 5 minutes of like scrolling through my Twitter feed on any given day, they want nothing to do with us ever again, you know, because they would see so much of this sort of petty, weird, you know, games where people are like taking little snatches of what the other person says and putting it in the worst possible light and denouncing them, you know, as a, you know, if you have the wrong position in one direction, you're a CIA agent. If you have it in the other direction, you know, you want to build a gulag, whatever. Like, so as far as what can be done about it, I guess there are really two questions. Like, one is like, what can be done about it on a larger societal level, and what can be done about it within the left. And on a larger societal level, I actually think if the left stopped denying that the problem exists, if we stop doing this knee-jerk, there's no such thing as cancel culture, which always reminds me of Tony Soprano yelling at Meadow, there is no such thing as the mafia. But if we stopped doing that, right, then I think we'd actually be well positioned to sort of take back the issue, because the right, and when I say the right, I'm including the I'm a classical liberal types, like, they love to complain about cancel culture, but they don't. First of all, they don't have any plausible story about where it comes from. Like, they just sort of, I think their theory is that it just sort of emerges just from leftism. And second, they certainly don't have a plausible solution to it, right? Like, all they really offer is just sort of eternally, scoring political points out of pointing out that it exists. Whereas I think the left's program might not, if implemented, completely eliminate the problem, but I think it would really mitigate it. Because, for example, we could advocate that these giant quasi-monopolistic tech companies like Twitter be taken under public ownership. And then, so instead of having a profit incentive to find ways to make them as addictive as at all possible, we could make collective democratic decisions about what we wanted them to look like. And certainly we want to rebuild the labor movement and end at-will employment, which would really take the sting out of a lot of this stuff, because there wouldn't be that omnipresent danger that somebody takes something the wrong way and they'll rat you out to your boss, and you'll be fired. And then I guess on the level of the left, like what we can do on the left, I think just one like really concrete thing, that those of us who do take this problem seriously on the left, who do think that that cancel culture is real, that there are many excesses and embarrassments of a certain kind of ultra identitarian leftism, I think that the most important thing maybe is that we just watch ourselves to make sure that we don't just become the mirror image of it. It's very easy, as my friend Adam Proctor, hosts the Dead Pundit Society, puts it, to sort of there's this classic, there's this essay from 2013 by Mark Fisher called Exiting the Vampire Castle, about what we would now think of as cancel cultures that manifest on the left. And Adam's got a nice line about how it's really easy to tell you're just kind of a vampire hunter, but just sort of set up shop in the basement of the vampire's castle, doing all the same things, just in reverse, right? That instead of how everybody who disagrees with you are racist now is a racist, now everybody who disagrees with you is a woke identitarian, and like you're just doing all the same stuff, right? Like that there's really no difference between the way that people can form these little cliques and denounce anybody for like who is perceived as deviating from that, right? And the stuff that we're objecting to when ultra woke identitarians do it. So I think that, I don't know, maybe this is kind of a lame hippie-ish answer, but I think just sort of being like compassionate and giving each other a break and not being too quick to like put a label on other people who we basically agree with politically, who we think get some of this stuff wrong. I think all that stuff can go a long way.
Lame hippie-ish answer is our MO for this show, so thank you, Ben.
Yeah, you're talking to the right people. And speaking of Ben, maybe this is a good segue to get into our mutual late great friend Michael Brooks and the wonderful article you wrote on Jacobin, on Cosmopolitan socialism, because I think one of the strongest elements in what Michael is advocating was this empathetic, compassionate, hippie response, which nevertheless had the kind of cutting, intellectual, critical, kind of fused with the hippie, right? So we're talking about like an analytical hippie or something like that. So maybe you want to unpack that a little bit as
sure.
The possible way forward for the left.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So yeah, this is something that Michael was very concerned with. In fact, I think it's something that I don't know. I wonder actually if he hadn't, passed, so unexpectedly this summer, if as this stuff went on, I think maybe a certain, portion of his audience, I think wouldn't have more fully realized that they didn't see eye to eye with him about all of this stuff. Since which some of that, might have happened already, but but he does, if you read Against the Web, he does very explicitly talk about some of what we've been talking about here, there, in certainly his critique in there of ideas about cultural appropriation, his the way that he discusses, there's a whole chapter where he gets into a lot, like the next to last chapter, the ways that the failures of the left have kind of paved the way for the pitch of these IDW guys he's criticizing in the book, that we've given them so much to work with. And if you watch one of the very last in-person speaking appearances he did before the pandemic drove everybody inside was at Lafayette College. And if you and that's the whole thing's available on YouTube. And if you watch that there, he's he lays a lot of the stuff we've been talking about out in a very very analytically rigorous, but also, since it's Michael, very funny way, and very compelling way in there. And yeah, I think that, in many ways, I don't know if this answers your question exactly, but I think like one of the things that I spent a lot of time thinking about, after a few weeks had passed since since he died, and obviously the overwhelming first reaction is just the enormity of the personal loss. That this is such a to risk of being cheesy, this is one of the most alive people, that I ever knew, and is just like at the cusp of a lot of the things that he was doing with his career, and it's, just so, it's just such an enormous tragedy on that personal level. But then, I think that as a little bit of time passed, started thinking a lot more about what a collective tragedy it is politically, because I really don't know anybody, who thinks, I don't know anybody who is on the contemporary left, I think, who has quite the skill that he did as a political communicator. And I think that really comes out in that Lafayette College speech, and especially in the QS, like his kids at the speech, who are, asking him some pretty annoying kind of college Democrat questions that would be very easy for somebody with Michael's politics to sort of score points off of, and dismissive of them. But he really doesn't do that, right? Like, he really tries very hard to engage with them, and to say something that's going to intersect with their worldview and they'll take seriously. And, is also funny and charismatic, because he always was. And so all of which is just to say that on these issues, I think that he was maybe uniquely positioned to intervene in a good way on them, because he did always, I think the characteristic Michael move was always sort of saying, okay, X is true, right? But, here's Y, which is also true, and it's also important, and we have to kind of wrestle with both of these things. And there's a way that I could imagine somebody doing that would seem sort of, I don't know, indecisive, or, not very compelling, but in his hands, it never was. It always felt like, oh yeah, I really want to, I want to wrestle with this with you, right? Like this is, you're laying this out in such an interesting way, right? That I want to be there with you. And yeah, and I think he did have that, look, speaking as somebody who didn't share all these interests, interests with him, right? I'm an atheist and I guess a materialist, whatever, right? And so Michael certainly had some spiritual interests that I didn't vibe with, that although, I mean, I think the pattern, in our relationship was that I would sort of express my disagreement, but never really go very deep into it because it felt lame, like it's sort of, like I did, it's like, oh yeah, it's like he's this sort of like much cooler older brother figure that that you don't want to so it's like, so there was some inbuilt, I think, social pressure not to go too deep into those issues, but whatever. I think despite that, right, I think that maybe he had a perspective that was very valuable, that maybe came easier to him because of those spiritual interests, which is this kind of willingness to have this like really like frank, unembarrassed emphasis on compassion, and yeah, I mean, the line that everybody quotes that that has kind of become a meme since his passing, like that sums that up really well, right? Is the thing about being ruthless with systems and compassionate with people, and that seems like something that he I don't want to exaggerate this. I mean, I think it'd be very easy in the aftermath of the death of somebody as widely beloved as Michael to kind of turn him into a two-dimensional plaster saint, and I have no interest in doing that, right? If only because the person that I knew was so much more interesting than that, right? So I mean, don't get me wrong, he could definitely be a hater. He like when he was like texting me about people who annoyed him, he could be very, very funny doing that. But that said, I think that he, I think that impulse in his personality was tempered by understanding that everybody is broken, and that we're all messing up all the time, and we do need to approach each other with compassion, and that there is this balance where you can do that without losing the ruthlessness towards systems. And I mean, like I think like he really, somebody who he really admired was Cornel West, who of course his West's particular Christian socialist perspective leads him to really taking some of this stuff to an extreme, but like an extreme that I think is that I admire much more than the opposite extreme, certainly, right? Where like West will go so far as to like he'll like honking. Even when he's talking about, I don't know, like George W. Bush or somebody, he'll be like, our dear precious brother George W. Bush, and then like he'll go on to say, our dear precious brother George W. Bush is a gangster and a war criminal, but but like he's got that first part in there at the beginning of the sentence. And even if I wouldn't personally go that far, I think that there's something really valuable about the impulse to sort of say, look, I mean, the reason that we're leftists in the first place is that we understand that everything that's wrong with the world isn't a function of individuals having evil moral character. It's a function of structures and systems being bad. And so I think that oftentimes that the prolonged powerlessness of the left can lead to a situation. This is really what I harp on in the new book, that where we really we tend to lose that, right? We tend to reframe politics in terms of individual morality, because we don't really have much hope oftentimes about actually winning, in the larger collective sphere. So politics sort of becomes this matter of showcasing your individual moral commitment. And then, it ends up becoming very easy to spend a lot of time interrogating other people's individual moral commitment. And that's where a big part of the problem, the problem comes in. And so I think that, I know this has been kind of a meandering answer, but I guess I would just say that I would just say that that like it's good that line has become such a meme, because I think that's exactly what we need, ruthlessness towards system and kindness towards people.
Yeah, great response. Thank you, Ben. As a kind of pivot, maybe we could throw in a comment from YouTube as a question.
Sure.
Because following Michael's passing, there was such a overwhelming sense not only of the loss for the left globally, but also the need to step up, right? Like Michael was demonstrating a way of thinking and being on the left that was just so, like you're saying, alive, but also deeply synthetic, intellectually curious, profoundly grounded, right? So it's not really like who else is doing it, but the question was like, nobody can replace Michael, but who else is thinking like Michael, and like who was he pointing to, right? Like how do we emphasize a cosmopolitan socialism as a culture building project for the left? And can you think of anyone or particular projects that you find inspiring and in a kind of the similar spirit?
Yeah, good. Yeah, I mean, like I think that there are different aspects of what he brought to the table that I think other people to varying extents do embody parts of it, certainly, and I mean I think that even though I think the way that he could bring all that together and the way that he could that he could just pitch it right as a political communicator was fairly unique, but he did spend the last couple of years since he started building his own show trying to bring together and showcase a lot of people who he did think were adding things that are important in that regard. And I think that I think that when it comes to certainly one of the biggest, like I think when he talked about cosmopolitan socialism, he really meant a couple things, right? So part of which is just internationalism, and part of which is this ideal of kind of how we can all live together in a way that we might need socialism to completely embody, right? But really, like, instead of sort of worrying about policing like boundary lines and what bits of culture belong to who or whatever, that synchronicity, like syncretic practices and sort of doing like kind of free and taking what's good from everything is a good thing, should be valorized as an ideal, and that a lot of what we've been talking about earlier about the failures of the left he really saw as undermining that. So I mean I think that certainly in terms of I guess I'll just say this much, right? I think that at least in terms of the element of that of sort of correcting the America-centrism of the American left, and really having more to say about global struggles and taking inspiration from those and like engaging with those issues more seriously. I think that two people who are both really good, really good for that, who who were both introduced to me by Michael's show, who I just had on mine a couple days ago, were Jean Baudulin and Daniel Bessner. I think they're both really valuable in that regard. I think Nando Vila is somebody who is who I think has a lot of interesting things to say about those global issues, and also I think embodies some of the I think some of what Michael did as far as as far as providing an image of the left that's funny and open and that like you like part of what was so good about Michael was just that like it never seemed like, like you never got the sort of like wagging finger that you can always see in the background in certain presentations of left politics. It was always a version of the left that you wanted to hang out with. And I think that Nando, kind of embodies some of that. And yeah, I guess that's three names. I'll just leave it there. And obviously, if anybody's listening to this and I didn't mention you, it's probably because I hate you. That's the only reason that somebody would have made it. So somebody wouldn't have made it into that list of three people.
Well, thanks, man. I think you definitely addressed my question on sort of integral theory and spirituality and the role that could play in maybe creating a better narrative for the left. One of my questions, I guess, with sort of, not reading much Marx and socialism was, how do you interpret or incorporate sort of a healthy, competitive, open market economy, and also combining that with your vision of socialism?
Yeah. So, so socialism and like the virtues of market economy, the things that we think that markets do well. Is that the question? Kind of as you see it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Right. I think that's a really good starting place. Since I think that if you want to think hard about like what kind of society we ultimately want, then you want to both sort of say, okay, like what are all the reasons that we quite rightly hate capitalism, and then what are the things about capitalist society, as it exists now that we wouldn't want to lose, that would be really bad to lose, and how can we get as much of the good stuff as possible without the part that makes it capitalism, and I do really emphasize as possible, because I think oftentimes it's really tempting, and this is something I see a lot on the socialist left, to kind of to sort of help ourselves to the assumption that we can just kind of work backwards from here's all the stuff that we don't like, and then when we have socialism, that'll get rid of all of those things that we don't like, and it won't come with any other problems, and we just sort of black box the details that we don't feel like, as long as you're just kind of saying, okay, we won't have, we won't have markets, we'll have, you don't really, like, it's almost like you don't really complete the sentence, right? Or if you do, you'll just sort of use phrases like planning or whatever that don't really clarify very much at all about what you have in mind. And I think this is actually, this kind of goes back to something Ryan was asking about earlier about what we can sort of clarify for ourselves and our project by engaging with the right. Because I think that oftentimes ideologically unsympathetic critics, conservative or libertarian or neoliberal critics, even though obviously I hate their answers, they are asking some of the right questions about this stuff, and we do have to take those questions seriously. So when we think about like the 20th century attempts at having completely non-capitalist economies in countries like the Soviet Union or Mao's China, then obviously those were not smash-in successes. They did some things well. They were very good, like my friend Bhaskar Sankara is the editor of Jacobin, who I'm actually co-writing a book about this right now with him and with Mike Beggs, who's a Australian economist, and so, but in Bhaskar's first book, The Socialist Manifesto, which I'd really recommend, he has this analogy. It might not be original to him, I don't know, but but that like the Soviet-style planned economies were basically all thumbs and no fingers, meaning that when it came to things like building tons and tons and tons of tractors or tons and tons and tons of tanks very quickly, they were great at that, right? Like so they did accomplish some impressive things as far as that kind of rapid industrial development. And, thank God for it, because like maybe the Nazis would have won World War II if they hadn't. But when it came to the sort of more fine-grained task of coordinating production with consumer preferences, which is what those kinds of right-wing libertarian critics will call the calculation problem, they sucked at that, right? Like that was the no fingers part, right? If the all thumbs and no fingers. And it's easy for that to sort of seem like, okay, well, who really, like it's easy to adopt kind of a posture as a leftist where you really dismiss the importance of that, right? Where you say like, whatever, right? So, all right, maybe we won't have 200 kinds of toothpaste, big deal, right? Who cares? But I think that really understates how much of a problem this was, because for one thing, if you think about the way that the Soviet Union, for example, ended, this is supposed to be a socialist society. It's supposed to be something that exists on, for the benefit of the working class majority. And that working class majority didn't lift a finger to defend that system when it was ending. In fact, most people at the time probably welcomed it. I think, maybe if you did an opinion poll 5 years later, they'd want it back because the kind of, kleptocratic gangster capitalism that replaced it was so bad. But at the time, they welcomed it leaving. And why did they welcome it? Well, some of it's because the political authoritarianism, of course, nobody likes, that kind of police state. But I don't think that's all of it. I think that a big part of it is that kind of frustration that when that disenfranchisement of Soviet citizens qua consumers, I think was really a massive source of disillusionment with the system, that you just sort of, your pockets might be full of rubles that you can't really spend on anything, because when you go to the grocery store, you just sort of have to hope that what you want is there, that you won't have either empty shelves or shelves bursting with stuff that you don't want. And I think that that's something that was very deeply resented by citizens of those societies, and that they and that was one of the main reasons for lack of public support for those systems. And sometimes we think about this in this sort of, it's almost like we're thinking in slogans more than in like concrete ideas. And so sometimes people say, oh, well, the problem is that the problem wasn't with the economic planning. The problem was that they didn't go far enough in the direction of, total communism, that there were still, people were still paid in rubles, etc. But that always, frankly, reminds me a little bit of when libertarians say that, okay, sure, capitalism as it exists might be awful, but if we had really free markets, then all these problems would disappear. So, well, I want some evidence there, right? Like I don't want to just accept that on faith. And sometimes people will say, "Oh, the problem wasn't." But then I think it's really useful to sort of say, "Okay, this might not be what you have in mind, but let's do the thought experiment and try to add some democracy to it and see if it would solve the problem." So, if you can imagine a version of the Soviet Union where you had free speech and free press and real multi-party elections, you kind of layered that onto the structure of the Soviet economy so that whatever party won a majority in the parliamentary elections that year got to appoint the head of the Soviet planning office, Gosplan, but otherwise the system was the same. And would those problems have been avoided? I don't think so, right? I think that the worst horrors of that system would have been avoided. I don't think you would have gotten, the Ukrainian famine in the 30s or the Great Leap Forward in China if Stalin or Mao had to worry about being reelected. That's true. But I don't think that the sort of day-to-day frustrations that Soviet citizens faced at the grocery store would have been alleviated if the political leadership behind the planning was different. And you can tell stories where we have like really, really radical direct democracy, but I'm also not super compelled by that. If nothing else, I think there's some technical problems, but also I think that that misses some of why socialism is desirable in the first place. I've spent enough hours of my life in faculty meetings that I'm never getting back to know that to have a very keenly honed sense that most human beings would hate the idea of having to spend their lives in meetings, to do all of this, radically, directly democratic, planning for various things. That sounds awful, right? Like what I want is, I think ideally one of the best things about socialism is that we could all have much more free time to spend on whatever we wanted to spend our lives on, and instead of doing like one of the most annoying things known to man, which is like sitting in meetings debating exactly how something is going to work. So I think that it's possible that we could get a totally marketless version of socialism at some point in the future, maybe because like AI technology got so good that we could outsource a lot of the stuff that would happen in these planning meetings to that. And I'm not being flippant. I don't rule that out at all, right? That could happen eventually. But as far as what could happen right now, what Bhaskar and Mike Beggs and I advocate in the new book is what we call full democratic socialism, meaning that we go beyond social democracy and not have a separate capitalist class anymore. But we do think that there would still have to be at this stage, right, some markets, some buying and selling. And so I think that what you could do is certainly you could have greatly expanded public sector. There's lots of evidence under capitalism we could have that without economic disaster. There lots of countries in the world that have state-owned oil industries and state-owned healthcare systems and things like that, and it all works great. But if you do need for those consumer coordination problems, right? If you do still need a market sector, it could at least be a market sector of worker-owned firms. And I guess I'll just wrap up on this point, right? Because I know it's already been a long answer. But I don't want to do what I'm accusing other people of doing at the beginning of the answer, which is just assuming, oh yeah, we'll have all the good things and none of the bad things. Trust us, that like, because I think that being real about this. I think that this kind of socialism, which, I mean, I don't know, sometimes called market socialism. I think that's not necessarily, I think that's a little misleading because, there would be markets, but there'd be more planning than there is now, certainly. But this kind of like mixed economy socialism, this full democratic socialist vision, there's still, I don't think we can help ourselves to the assumption that like all of the problems that beset capitalism wouldn't exist here. I think that you would still have some of those because some of those problems are a function of the division of society into workers and capitalists, which would be ended by workers control the means of production. But some of them are just functions of the way markets work in any society, and some of those would still persist. And I think we have to be real about that. And so you'd still need things like a strong regulatory state. And then sometimes, like I think a very perceptive kind of critic will say, well, hold on, right? If you think that there are at least some of the problems of capitalism can be solved, by this kind of state intervention, well, why can't we just do that under capitalism, right? Why do we need this? And I think the best answer to that is just to say, yeah, look, you would store regulation for some of the things that we think of as like social democracy right now, but I'm much more confident in the ability of the political process to lead to good, regulatory interventions and things like this, if that political process doesn't involve participation by people like Jeff Bezos and the Walton family.
Yeah, so I don't think we have too much more time, but if we could squeeze in one question, a kind of a follow-up
Sure.
transitional question. On the subject of worker cooperatives, I think, we're very interested in, Richard Wolff has been popularizing this very much.
Yeah, I love Richard Wolff.
The example of Mondragon comes up quite a bit. And the retort is always, the argument against this is always that, well, Mondragon is an interesting case study, but it hasn't really taken on and hasn't really scaled. Sure, it's interesting, but this is not a viable path that could be scaled in terms of a new labor consciousness or a new kind of democratic shift in work. But how do we respond to that, and what are the kind of the limits or the inhibitions in terms of what is restraining something like that from taking off right now? Is it just too early?
Well, it's not. I mean, it's not too early because I think that to give the critics their due, there have been worker cooperatives for a very long time. Like, you can find Karl Marx, talking about how excited it is that there are some cooperatively owned factories, in like the 1850s. So it's like whatever the problem is, it can't just be that like we need some more time for these to develop and take up a bigger chunk of the economy, because I think the evidence is in that like what makes Mondragon such an exciting case does have to do, as you say, with scale. That it's easy to say, okay, hey, here's like, you know, a successful, you know, cooperative small business that has 10 worker owners in it. But somebody might be skeptical that, you know, like if we're talking about having like the entire private sector be worker owned, they might be skeptical about that. And then I think it's very useful to say, hey, here's Mondragon that has 80,000 members and is one of the biggest employers in its region of Spain. But that said, I think there is a sense in which it's a fluke. The sense in which it's a fluke is that I think the evidence is in from like, you know, good like 150 years or so of practice that it's never ever going to happen that these are just going to sort of organically grow to like outcompete regular capitalist businesses and just take over the economy that way, right? That won't and can't happen. That in every capitalist economy, they are a tiny, tiny portion of the overall economy. The question, I think the more interesting question is why is that? And then what does that tell us about strategy going forward? And I think the answer to the why is that question is that it's not because once they get going, they're less successful than other kinds of businesses. If you look at the studies that have been done on this, the empirical literature, it seems to be the case that once they get going, you know, on average, you know, look, most businesses of any kind, of course, you know, fail, but, you know, like but on average, worker cooperatives are no less likely to succeed than any other kind of business. So it's not that they have a higher death rate than regular capitalist hierarchical companies. It's that they have a much lower birth rate. Like that seems to be the problem. And you say, okay, why do they have such a lower birth rate? And I think that the main reason is just that the distribution of starter capital is wildly unequal. It's much easier to attract investors if you could reward that initial investment with ongoing ownership shares of the company, which obviously would completely defeat the point for a worker co-op. And then also that the risk element, right? You know, that if somebody said, you know, like if somebody says to you tomorrow, hey, why don't you quit your job and go in on this cooperative, you know, business venture with me? First of all, if there are any kind of substantial capital costs at all, right, which there are really, the more you start thinking about it for all kinds of things, right? You don't have to be doing heavy industry. Capital costs to be enormous. I mean, even if you want to, you know, you're a huge Always Sunny fan and you want to like start up your own Irish pub, you know, then like you actually start thinking about the costs of that, of renting the space and getting the liquor license and you know, and buying all the booze and all that stuff, right? Then actually your initial business costs are pretty enormous. And so and even if you do get, you know, some sort of small business loan, right, which you might not get in the first place because there's because it's you know, like you just might not be a good candidate for such a loan because you don't have many financial resources to start with. But even if you do get it, then you'll very rationally be worried that, hold on, but if this fails, which frankly it probably will because most new businesses do, then we're on the hook for this, and we're really going to be in trouble. Okay, so real briefly, I don't want to like pretend that I can like put all of the very good concerns that somebody might have about this to bed in the next 3 minutes, but I also don't want to just do what I don't like it when socialists do and just sort of black box all the hard questions. So I think that the solution, what Bhaskar talks about in the Socialist Manifesto, if you read David Schweikart has a really good book called After Capitalism, By the way, if you buy any of these books, you should buy them from Red Emma's, because that's a worker-owned bookstore in Baltimore. You can order books from online. But what they talk about is that if we nationalize the banks, then we can have publicly owned banks that give the main source of financing for new cooperatives would be grants for capital goods, crucially not loans but grants, so that you would be paying the equivalent of interest on a loan, but not the principal, and that, so essentially what you would have is you would get rid of this problem about risk and starter capital by essentially having worker cooperatives renting the actual physical means of production from the state. And I guess the very last thing I'd say about this is just this, that I think that there's certain kind of socialist who is like rightly excited about completely getting rid of all the many ills of capitalism, which obviously I want them to be excited about, who might look at this and be kind of underwhelmed because in a way, right, like we're just mixing and matching different elements that have already existed in the real world, and it might not quite scratch the itch that some people have for a truly radical break. And if you are watching this and you are thinking that, I just urge you to take a step back and think, okay, but what we would be talking about here, right, with this kind of full democratic socialism, is the first human society that's existed since the Neolithic Revolution that wasn't divided into a ruling class and a subservient labor force. As Joe Biden once said in a very different context, that's a big fucking deal.
That's a good way to end it. Well, thank you, Ben. It's been wonderful, very illuminative, and you have a book list for us, basically, that's accrued now in the chat. So appreciate your time. Folks who want to tune in to Ben, you've got a show on Mondays, right? Mondays at 5 p.m., I think?
7:30.
7:30. Okay.
Yep.
Great.
Yeah, Monday 7:30 Eastern Standard Time. So yeah, the one coming up this Monday is with Matt McManus about some articles that he's written for Jacobin about the relationship between Marxism and philosophical liberalism. And then Matthew Sitman, who is the co-host of the Know Your Enemy podcast, and who also wrote a really good essay for Dissent about leftism and country music. So I'm going to bring David Griscom on to interview him about that.
Yeah, David Griscom.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Ben. Looking forward to that.
Thanks so much, guys.
Yep. Take care.
Thank you, Ben.
All right, bye.
Okay, I think we're still live, folks, so what we're going to do now, if that is okay, is just do a little bit of, I think Matt had to run too, but yeah, we could do a little bit of reflection, post-interview conversation, take some more questions from the live stream. We are streaming across a couple of different platforms, so I just want to thank everyone who's been on Twitch, posting some comments there. Let's see if we could just switch over here and get a better view. 1 second. Yes. Oh, you know what? That's not working. Sorry, 1 second, folks. Let me get rid of Matt's video feed. Switch over here. Cool. And then we're going to pop over to the chat. So, Ryan, how was it?
Hey, Jeremy.
How's it going?
Yeah, he's really my kind of guy, like in terms of his style. And I really appreciate his kind of like anti-dogmatic ideologue approach and like really other arguments, from the other side of the aisle very seriously, not shying away from debates, not shying away from engaging with the tough questions, and not, black boxing them or ignoring them.
Sure.
And what my main takeaway, my favorite part of the conversation was what he said about Michael Brooks, about grappling with difficult tensions, paradoxically, and not coming across as being wish-washy or waffling on the fence, but doing so in a very integrally inspired way that draws other people in to participate in that kind of grappling with difficult value tensions or contradictions or paradoxes. And that's something I always struggle with myself, because I think a lot of people do see me as a waffler and as like a spineless, piece of seaweed. But Michael was able to do it in a way where that was really inspiring other people, and that's not something that really is encouraged or valorized in today's society. It's very black and white and one-sided. And so, yeah, his appreciation of Michael Brooks, I think, was very telling about the kind of person, character that he is.
Yes, I agree. And I really appreciated the thoroughness of his answers, just in terms of there's really no direct way to answer a question like, well, how do we scale worker cooperatives? Because there's so many contextual layers there, historical, economic, legal. So, the answer tends to be kind of murky and complex, and it does tend to require a systemic sort of thinking to really kind of give something that is constructive. And it may sound, like he was saying, like this may not sound very exciting, but in terms of actual leverage of power, right, in terms of actual practical solutions that would make a difference over the long term, I think these are the kinds of answers that we need to, if not get excited about, then at least work on implementing and being literate about, etc. I also really appreciated his emphasis on just having a historical literacy of what's been going on in the 20th century in terms of worker cooperatives, and pointing the way towards Daniel Bessner and some of these folks, or Sankara's book on socialism, which I still haven't read, admittedly, the Socialist Manifesto. I definitely want to read that. So, yeah, no, I think it was a rich conversation, and like you're saying, his appreciation for Michael's cosmopolitan socialism. He really hit on where it mattered, which is in the heart, in compassion, in actually helping people. In terms of, as he wrote in the article, like these are not intellectual or abstract concerns. This is very real, grounded concerns with making sure people are fed, making sure they have a home, making sure they have decent health care when they're sick. And that is the ultimate concern, is the material wellness of other human beings, right? And even when it comes to this, I mean, It was be ruthless against systems, be kind to people. That's ultimately what we need to focus on, because whenever we don't do that, when people are always means to ends, a bill that's going to screw over a certain population, but it's sort of going to help us move in this direction, we really have to consider the human factor a lot more than we do. And obviously, with our current economic system, it's very difficult to do that. It tends to abstract, right? It tends to dehumanize. So, yeah, I mean, it's radically simple when we get down to like what the principles and values of the left are. And I liked his answer too about towards the beginning, in terms of what could the democratic socialist movement during the Bernie campaign have done better. And I think the emphasis on freedom was a really interesting pivot, because that tends to be the more conservative argument, that I want to be free to do X or X or Y. And, I think Ben was really arguing, well, we really needed to adopt that. The left needs to adapt freedom and the principle of freedom in the same way, like Michael was always talking about. Well, the left needs spirituality. We can't just give it up to the intellectual dark web or give it up to the conservatives.
Right.
So, yeah, great responses in general.
Yeah, well, just a couple of thoughts on that, Jeremy. I think that the freedom thing is interesting too, because you're taking a value, a very core value and core identity of your opponent, right, and remixing it in a way that's very relevant for what you're trying to promote. I mean, that's the reason why I consider myself, left and progressive, is because it's really about freedom. I want more freedom to do this kind of stuff, and I don't have to worry about all the little things like how I'm going to get healthcare for the year or how I'm going to pay all the bills. If that's not at the front of my mind, it frees me up to pursue, higher pursuits or things that are more authentic to me, and I can contribute value to the world in my own way. And I think what I think needs to happen next is a kind of examination of values that are not currently explicitly, embraced by the left, and remixing them in a creative way right? What is freedom? What is a 21st century understanding of freedom, right? What is a holistic freedom? Does that include material, economic, spiritual, emotional, psychological freedom, right? Interior freedoms, exterior freedoms, negative freedoms, positive freedoms. And just having a more thorough view of that, or even something like personal responsibility, right? Isn't a worker co-op where you're also the owner of the means of production, have to bear that risk yourself? Doesn't that demand a radical upgrade in personal responsibility as a member, now owner of that business, right? So I think there's a lot of ways we can make that marriage happen. One thing I wanted to ask Mr. Burgis was about, it sounded like when he was talking about, and he mentioned this in the Cosmopolitan Socialism article, that some of his disagreements with Michael Brooks about spirituality, and he was saying that he's a atheist and materialist. So it sounded like he had personal disagreements with Michael Brooks. But I wanted to ask him if he also had, what should I say, larger ideological disagreements in terms of how that fits into the left. Like, does he have a fear that if the left were really to more explicitly embrace interior issues of value, purpose, meaning making, and consciousness and spirituality, if that would actually, turn off voters or alienate people with more material concerns? And I think Michael Brooks had a very clever way of doing it, where he married the two very, very consciously, right? Where the spiritual values are rooted in the material concerns, or providing material concerns for people who are suffering. And I think there is a kind of danger of if you go too far down the kind of Marianne Williamson path, where it looks kind of out of touch. I think that's kind of the danger. And I wonder if he had that same concern. I would love to ask him another time.
Yeah, no, that's true. I think I wonder about that too, but I also kind of wondered the flip side. If, I'm not really worried about the left going to Marianne Williamson, but I'm more concerned about the mediational element of this, which is to actually construct or to build a working class coalition or a left coalition where we have, the spiritual left, who tends to be the Marianne Williamson types, the Burning Man consciousness culture types, who unfortunately are kind of succumbing to QAnon conspiracy theories at the moment, as we've been talking about. So,
Right.
We have different coalitions who I think would be a tremendous aid to building a left coalition for the 21st century. But so I'm more concerned about how we don't alienate each other from each other, right? Like the more secular oriented folks, would they be how comfortable would they be with the Marianne Williamsons? And are there ways to articulate common ground? I think, that mediational space of, well, what are we all concerned in, and what do we all care about? And I do think it does come down to, material concerns. Now, there's different ways they might read that. They might read that in a more spiritual sense and say, well, we want an enlightened, compassionate, bodhisattvic society, or we have some kind of energetic thing about this, and we all do group meditations before we go into some kind of activist event. But the material concerns in terms of their embodiment is like the same, like feed people, help people, make sure people aren't, homeless and out on the street, create a better society. Yes, there's practical ways to do this that will need the more economic-oriented leftists to be able to understand and to comment on and put forward solutions like the banking solution that Ben was talking about with worker cooperatives. But we need, I think we really need mediational translators that you've been emphasizing, that are able to to take that and approach the spiritual leftists with, and vice versa, right? Like, look, we all have the same concerns, we're just having different elements of it. So I do think it requires people who have that fluidity of mind, like Michael Brooks had, to be able to actually build a left that isn't hyper fragmented. And yeah, so just kind of riffing on what you're talking about here. Let's see, we have a question from, can you clarify Marianne Williamson? Not sure what you mean by that, head hunch, but just in terms of Marianne Williamson, her spirituality, right? Like, she's California consciousness culture. She writes a lot of books about spirituality. She ran for president, obviously, in Democratic primary. So she's involved in politics. I think she ran for, or was a congresswoman in California for a number of years.
For Congress, lost.
Right.
Yeah.
So we have, a kind of voting block of maybe boomer-aged literal hippie generation spiritual folks, and they're a very big economic block. Like we're in the consciousness culture and in the integral community, and they do take up, you know, a significant chunk of the people that we meet in a lot of these events. And so we know they're a voting bloc as well. So it was kind of interesting to see Marianne Williamson as somebody who was kind of representing that politically, maybe in the same way that the conservative religious right was kind of putting forward their own political bloc, but much more successfully. So the question is, you know, can we bring forward the spiritual counterculture as a political bloc as well, and actually get them engaged and et cetera? So yeah, I don't know if that helps clarify Head Honch, but good question. Let's see. And Ryan, you can see the comments here, right? Like you can see the stream a little bit. Good.
Someone mentioned Caleb Maupin.
Caleb Maupin. I'm not.
Yeah,
familiar.
I'm a little familiar. I haven't read his books, but I saw him on debates, and it seems like an interesting. I'd like to check his stuff out more. So thanks for the tip. He's an advocate for our own form of like American socialism, and he has ideas of what that looks like and what industries to nationalize and so forth.
Interesting. Yeah, there's an earlier comment. Let me see if I could put that up separately so folks can see that and fix the. Yeah, that's like a separate little pop-up here. Here we go. Yeah, okay. So, constructive patriotism from a 21st century socialist perspective. Oh, they're having a web conference today at 4 p.m. Cool. Yeah, well, maybe we'll check that out. Thank you. Let's see if there's any other interesting comments that we missed over the stream. There was a couple of really good ones. This one I thought was interesting from earlier. Just about the element of imperialism that maybe like someone like Daniel Bessner would be more suited or more just literate about in terms of how that affected the USSR, but Ben's solution of a shorter-term limits for Stalin would have only hastened the fall of the USSR, as imperialist powers always swarm on anti-imperialist countries when there is a transition of leadership. Yeah, I don't know. I don't really have too much to comment on there, but I do think that's certainly an element to consider in terms of the history of the USSR and its need to compete in an imperialist manner, you know, with the United States. We've been talking a lot about economics and social systems, but there was also this imperialist, militaristic reality, of course, that the History Channel loves to focus on in a very one-sided way. So certainly an aspect that needs to be commented on. I don't know if you have any thoughts, Ryan, about that.
Oh yeah, I need to do my homework on that before I say anything.
yeah, I feel the same way, honestly. So
I'd be talking out of my ass if I was making some of that.
Yeah. Let's see if any other ones. You know, I like Christian from earlier. We may have to prepare and develop ourselves for a decentralized world and decentralized structures. I definitely think that is certainly the way things hopefully will be going. Like I feel like we haven't really connected the dots entirely, but we have things like worker cooperatives, like Mondragon as a case study. We have cooperatives and platform cooperatives in general, which have been adopted semi-universally in terms of, you know, I hear about them in all sorts of cities, and especially in the tech world on a smaller level or smaller scale. We have peer-to-peer currencies. There's a lot of hype around that. So I get the sense that, you know, digital culture wants things to go in this decentralized direction. And, you know, we've been talking about when it comes to like our conversation with Matt Segal, the sort of Alexander Dugin direction of this sort of ethno-nationalist retreat from the global sphere. So we have a kind of conservative take on decentralization, and then we also have a kind of internationalist take on it, which is much more cooperative. You know, Michael Brooks, in the conversation I had with him a year or two ago on mutations, before he called it cosmopolitan socialism, he was saying we need some kind of planetary meshwork. And I know there's internationalist socialism going on right now, so there's pushes for this. So I definitely think this is the direction things are going, but it's just so incipient. And I think it requires the kind of boring nitty-gritty answers that like Ben was talking about. Like, well, maybe there's a way to have worker-owned or decentralized banking systems first, or some kind of banking innovations first to help that kind of startup capital. We might find some of the solutions in that direction. So maybe. Let's see if there's any others here. Yep, rest in power, Michael Brooks. Thanks, folks. Okay, yeah. Oh, of course, Brent was on earlier when we were talking about cancel culture at the beginning, and he was mentioning, Brett Weinstein trying to get Matt Leck fired as a perfect example of in terms of our spheres, like this is happening on the IDW as well. The IDW is not afraid to use cancel culture for their own, or weaponize it for their own devices as well. My buddy Nick says he misses my my beard. Thanks, Nick. I did shave. Wow, this was like more than one question. Yes, I cleaned up. Let's see. A few more comments. This one from Christian. Clarifying this, I do like socialism and centralized power as a stopgap, but there is a future where the individual has to develop and be able to make good transactions. Yeah, I mean, a stopgap is a good way to put it. We want a social safety net. We want some basic implementation of socialistic programs. Ben mentioned Nordic countries, and I think we even were talking about this as well with Thomas Bjorkman, that the concept of Bildung and self-realization is something that is inherently both individual and socialistic, even in terms of its implementation in Nordic countries. Bjorkman was talking about how, these Bildung retreat centers, realization centers, were socialized to some degree. They were subsidized by the government, and for students, they were funded in part by unions on occasion. So, the socialistic elements of a society where the individual is actualized and self-realized is contingent as well on the collective. And Matt said this really well, Matt Segal. Ryan, do you remember how he put it? The individual is a collective act, right? To become an individual is something collective, and vice versa.
Yeah. He was talking about Whitehead's philosophy of concrescence in his process philosophy, and about how, in that view, the individual is a consummation or a product of the collective, right? So it's not this kind of classical liberal Cartesian idea that we start from the individual and then get to the collective, but actually the individual is a product and entangled with deeper environmental, structural, collective forces, and is birthed from that. So we're not completely throwing out the individual in favor of a collectivism, a collective ontology, but we're understanding intricately how the individual emerges from the collective and their continual relationship and entanglement.
Yeah, entanglement's a good word. I think, and even in terms of like what we talk about on this channel is like integral theory. For those of you who are new on Twitch, we talk about integral theory. We talk about the hippie stuff that Michael Brooks was interested in, and that's what growing down really is, and that's mutations as well as a sort of complement to that. But in terms of the history of consciousness and the history of the development of the modern sense of self as the individual, I think this turn towards the collective and understanding that the individual is a process that is entangled in collectivity is a deeper way to understand and appreciate our individuality. Like it's a deeper way to realize the individual and to understand the individual. I even think like a decade ago, just on the kind of the internet culture analog sense, Maria Popova was talking about combinatorial creativity, and she has a very interesting blog. You may have heard of it, Brain Pickings. It's been around for ages now, but one of the things she was talking about with internet culture and curation is the kind of sense that we are understanding what it means to be an individual better now, in the sense that they're kind of an assemblage. There's a sort of rhizomatic quality of like all of these distributed ideas and influences that pop up in a very unique singularity of a person's, synthesis of those ideas or aggregation of those ideas. And maybe that's an innovation. Maybe that's a movie like Star Wars in terms of cultural production, which is influenced by, mid-century pulp science fiction films and World War II films and stories, etc., and then kind of all swarming together to create Star Wars is one of these examples of kind of an aggregate cultural creativity. But the idea is the individual is more of this network, right? We come together as individuals through this assemblage of different influences. And I think to understand this is to appreciate the individual better. And we might even argue that a society that has this concrescence that you were talking about is a society that actually is better suited for the individual to flourish and better suited for the collective to be, in a healthy sense, enacted, right? So I think, talking about these things in terms of cultural evolution and cultural phenomenology, in terms of our sense of self and world, our sense of collective identity and individual identity, are very important. And that's definitely the consciousness dimension that Michael Brooks was very interested in. So, yeah, let's see. Yeah, we did the talk about atomized individual before. Yeah, we talked about that. All right. So I think we're at 2 o'clock, so we've gone about 90 minutes, normal time. Any closing reflections, Ryan, or should we wrap it up for today?
Yeah, thanks everyone in the chat, and yeah, thank you, Jeremy. This was fun.
Awesome. All right, everybody. See you next weekend, and feel free to follow up with any comments or questions on Twitter, etc., etc. So take care. Have a good day, everyone.
Bye-bye.